Hello mate, what are you saying? I'm Joe, a content creator from Lonesome Studios, and today I'm going to talk about synthesis. So I made a little track and we can talk about some of the sounds afterwards. Okay, cool. So yeah, that was the track. So, synthesis, let's talk about it. Let's talk about making sounds and sound design. So, going to start by using Logic's stock plugins, because I think that's the easiest way to explain this concept. And then we're going to go more in depth as we go further into the track. Okay, cool. So let's talk about synthesis. I'm going to open up one of Logic's stock synths. We're going to go for, let's go for ES2, and we're going to explain quite clearly how to create sound. So let's start from the start. Okay, so what we have here, our basic sine tone. So your oscillator stage is the first stage of your sound design, where you essentially pick your different waves. And when you're looking at them, essentially the differences are the brightnesses of the waves. So here we have our sine wave, as we heard earlier. Okay, that's just a basic single tone sound. We can move on to our triangle wave, which is a little bit more bright. So it has that sort of buzzy quality to it. And then we have a sawtooth, extremely buzzy sound, and our square wave, which is essentially the most bright of the sounds that you can choose to make from. Let's go with our square wave, because that's going to give us the most to work with for this demo. I'm going to push the mix over here, up here to oscillator 1. Now, generally, in the oscillator section, you have a mix which allows you to blend between each of the different oscillators, because usually a synth will offer you more than one oscillator, which will allow you to mix the sound of two different waves. It can also allow you to tune and detune waves independently, which gives you some interesting effects. For example, if we pick a sine wave here and a sine wave here, and we bring that one down, push this one up a little bit, you see we get that beating sound. If you start changing around, messing around with tuning, for example, or you can push them up by an octave to push the wave into a higher range. Let's take that back down to 0 again. You see, so we have lots to play around with. You can also change the amount of voices and the way the oscillator functions. So, for example, it can be in polyphonic mode, which allows you to play multiple notes at once. Or you can be in monophonic mode, which only allows you to play one note at once. See that? It's only picking one note there. Legato mode, which allows you to essentially play one note into the next note, into the next note, without triggering the envelope again. We'll explain that more later. And unison mode, which allows you to play multiple voices at once. So on here we've got 8 voices, so that would be 8 sine waves, or 8 repeats of this oscillator section playing over the top of each other. Anyway, so let's move on to the filter section. So what is a filter? Well, essentially a filter is a dedicated EQ for your synth. Usually it becomes in low pass mode, which allows you to cut out top end frequencies, band pass mode, which allows you to cut out bottom and top end frequencies, and high pass mode, which allows you to cut out the bottom frequencies. So for example, if we close this, put this back up to oscillator 1, bring this back down to 0, go to a square wave, so we have the most brightness. I'm going to turn this down a little bit. Buzzy sound. And what we can do, if, say at the moment, we are on low pass filter, take the cutoff, which is essentially the frequency the filter is at, bring it down so we get that sound. Allows you to control those high frequencies. Move on to high pass, does the opposite. Allows you to remove those lower frequencies. Then we have our band pass and notch filters. A band pass is essentially a mix between a high pass and a low pass. See that? And then you have what ES2 is calling a peak filter, which is a notch filter, which essentially cuts out a specific frequency range, the opposite of a band pass filter. Also on the filter, we have our resonance control. A resonance control gives us the ability to boost the frequency at which the filter is sitting at. So this can give your sound a bit more brightness and a bit more character and really allow that frequency, that cutoff frequency, to stand out. Now, this is particularly useful for generating more natural sounds, because often you have, I guess, a lot of peaks and a lot of troughs in sounds that are more natural. And by having this, it sort of gives it a more, I guess, a more natural kind of sound to it, you know. So you see the difference between this and this. This is more smoother. This is more smooth, sorry. Bad English. But that just has a little bit more character, you see. Now, what we have here as well is we have this filter works. It has a 2-stage filter, and you can blend between the two, which allows you more control over your sounds. Okay, so on to envelopes now. Now, envelopes are really important for creating a natural peak and fall to your sound. So let's go through the different stages. Now, when you're using ES2, envelope 3 controls your amplifier, which is essentially the volume of your sound. So let's open that filter back up so we can hear the sound again. And we're going to leave it there. Let's turn that down a bit. Let's leave it there, okay? So now we have our square wave coming through into our filter. The top end is being filtered off, and there's a little resonance to our sound. So when we go into the envelope, we have 4 sections. So we have our attack, which is essentially the time it takes for the sound to reach its maximum volume. The decay, the time it takes for your sound to drop down to its regular sustaining level. The sustain, which is the level the sound sits at once it's being played, and then the release, which is the time it takes for the sound to go from its sustain level to nothing, basically. So let's hear that. We have a bit more context. If we take off attack, buzz, you see how it just sort of pops in. It's up the attack. You see that it sort of swells in more, and you can see how that might be nice for nice ambient sounds, for string sounds, for example. Now, I would say it as well, just as a pointer for when you're dealing with your attack, leave it at 0. You're always going to get that little pop at the start. And there's a lot of times where I get that pop and I'm thinking, well, you know, what's going on? Of course, it's the attack. So make sure, if you're going to just a little bit of attack into your sound, if you're, you know, this is just troubleshooting here, you know, and still has the same sort of punch, but without that horrible, nasty click at the top. So let's get rid of our decay and our sustain. So if we bring the decay back up, we have this sort of pew kind of sound. You know, that decay is, as I said, it's the time it takes for it to get to this sustain level. Now here at the moment, I've got the sustain level as 0. So that is essentially the time it takes for the sound to go from its peak after the attack down to 0. If you hold it out, bring up the sustain. Okay, and then bring up the release as I let go. Cool, that makes sense. Now, we don't just have to use envelopes on amplifiers. We can also use envelopes on filters. So if we come over to the routing section, let's take one that has nothing on it so far, this one. So what we're going to do is we're going to go for cutoff 1, and we're going to select envelope 2. That means from envelope 2, sorry, it is affecting the cutoff frequency of envelope of the filter 1. So if we start to bring that up, you see how that changes the sound. We can bring this down. You see how the sound opens up and drops back down as it continues on. And again, this can really help to give a more musical, natural sound to your synth sounds, because it gives it, I guess, movement and variation across time rather than just on, off, on, off, on, off. So yeah, typically your filter might have an envelope attached to it, but you can also attach the envelope to any other part of the synth. For example, you can put it onto pitch, and like with an instrument like a guitar, a bass, for example, like when they're initially plucked, they have that sort of pitch envelope that goes pew, which can, you know, again, make your sound a bit more musical, natural. So before we move on to talking about LFOs and resampling, if you're enjoying the video and you're starting to learn something, then like it and give us a subscribe. So, LFOs, the last part of our synth. Let's dive into that. Now, an LFO is another way, much like an envelope, to modulate some of the characteristics of our synthesizer. So let's put one onto our filter, and we can hear it on our cutoff, so we can hear how it's working. Now, essentially, an LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. It's much like the oscillator section of our synth, except at a frequency that's so low, human hearing can't pick it, we can't detect it, essentially. So if we route our, so again, let's go for cutoff 1, set the source to, let's go LFO2, because we can match that to a tempo, and then let's push that up, so we can start to hear it. See, we get that sound. Well, that one. Now, as we change the speed of LFO2, you can hear how the cutoff is affected. Now, in ES2, this also has the ability to be matched to tempo. So, this is currently free moving, but we can move it down to match our tempos. So there we have it. We have our sound. We've made something. So then how do we get crazy with this? You know, how do we turn it from this, I guess, rather basic sound into something more nasty, something more horrible? Well, we use resampling. It's a great technique. It's a great technique to start messing around with your audio files and creating something crazy. Now, I'm not going to go too far into it with resampling. This is really up to you to go away and experiment with. But essentially, the idea is to record a sound, much like this, bounce it out, add effects, add more effects, automate those effects, and then resample it, bounce it out again, automate again. You know, use the ability you have to cut up and affect audio files outside of just adding on effects to manipulate the sound into more interesting and useful things. So that's it. That's sound design. Like, well, it's not all of it, but like it's enough to get going. So as always, you know, like the video, comment what it is that you do with this knowledge, subscribe, follow us on Instagram, all that good stuff. So in the next video, I'm going to be moving on, talking about FM synthesis using Logic's EFM1. So I'll see you there.